800 degrees. That's the exact temperature where steel begins to warp and hope begins to melt. And that's exactly how hot the nursery was becoming for Elara Holbrook. 9 months pregnant and just days away from her due date, Elara wasn't preparing for a lullaby. She was fighting for her life inside a literal oven, locked in by the one man who had promised to be her anchor, her husband Victor. But this isn't just a story about a house fire. It's about the one thing Victor Holbrook forgot to calculate in his perfect murder. He forgot that every fire has a witness, and he never expected that the man rushing into the flames would be the brother Elara hadn't seen in 25 years. This is the story of the inferno that meant to erase a woman, but ended up reuniting a bloodline. And trust me, the look on Victor's face when he sees who walked out of that smoke, you won't want to miss it. The deadbolt clicked with a finality that made Elara's heart stop before the smoke even reached her. It was a cold, metallic sound that signaled the end of her world. "Victor!" she called out, her voice already thickening as the first wisps of gray drifted through the floorboards. No answer, only the sound of a car engine roaring to life in the driveway, and then the smell. The heavy, sweet, unmistakable scent of gasoline. She lunged for the door, her heavy belly making every movement in agony. She grabbed the handle. It didn't budge. She pulled. She hammered, the same desperate rhythm of a trapped animal. Her hands, usually soft from nursery prep, were already red from the rising heat of the wood. Then, the baby monitor on the dresser crackled to life. "I'm sorry, Elara." "Truly," Victor's voice came through the speaker, calm as a Sunday morning. "But the debt collectors don't take 'I love you' for an answer. That $3 million policy, though, it settles everything. It's a fresh start for me." Elara pressed her face against the door frame, trying to find a sliver of clean air. "Victor, please. The baby. It's your daughter. I already said goodbye to her, Elara. Think of it as a mercy. Life would have been hard with a father in prison for gambling debts." The monitor went dead. The silence that followed was replaced by the roar of the beast. The fire was alive now, licking at the base of the door. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on her lungs. Each breath felt like swallowing molten lead. She looked down at her pale yellow dress, the one Victor had told her to wear because it looked so bright and cheerful. Now, the thin fabric was clinging to her skin with sweat and ash, offering zero protection against the 800-degree monster. A sharp, searing pain shot through her abdomen, not from the heat, from within. The stress, the smoke, the sheer terror. The baby was coming. Now. "Not here," Elara gasped, collapsing onto the soot-stained carpet. "Not like this." She looked at the window. It was high, small, and the glass was already beginning to spiderweb from the temperature outside. She was trapped in a nursery turned crematorium. But as she felt the first true contraction rip through her, a shadow appeared against the orange glow of the window. A silhouette in a heavy helmet. She didn't know it yet, but her husband's perfect murder had just run into a miracle. Before we go any further, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, and stay with me to the end while we uncover the shocking moment Victor realizes the man who came through the flames isn't just a firefighter, it's the brother Elara thought she had lost forever. The scent of lavender and vanilla usually filled the Holbrook home, but tonight there was a sharp, chemical undertone that Elara couldn't quite place. She stood in the center of the nursery, her hand resting protectively on the high curve of her belly. The room was perfect. The walls a soft, calming sage, the crib hand-carved, and the window overlooking the quiet suburbia they had moved to just 3 years ago. "Elara, honey, are you ready? I have a surprise." Victor's voice drifted up the stairs, smooth and warm, like a vintage wine. Elara smiled, though a sharp pang of fatigue shot through her lower back. At 9 months pregnant, even standing felt like a marathon, but Victor had been so attentive lately. After months of late nights and hushed, panicked phone calls about market volatility and portfolio restructuring, he finally seemed to have found his footing again. He had promised her that tonight, their 3rd anniversary, would be the start of their new life. "Coming, Victor," she called back, smoothing down the thin, pale yellow maternity dress he had bought for her that morning. "It makes you look like a ray of sunshine," he told her with a kiss. "Wear it tonight. I want to remember you exactly like this." She made her way down the hallway, her steps heavy. As she reached the top of the stairs, she noticed something odd. The hallway runner, a thick Persian rug she adored, felt damp under her bare feet. She frowned, looking down. A dark, translucent stain was spreading across the fabric, snaking out from beneath the guest room door. "Victor, did a pipe burst?" "Don't worry about the house, Elara," he said, appearing at the bottom of the staircase. He looked dashing in his charcoal suit, though his eyes were strangely bright, almost feverish. "Tonight is about us, about the future. I've set everything up in the dining room." He walked up the stairs to meet her, taking her hand. His grip was tight, unusually tight. As he led her back toward the nursery, Elara felt a wave of unease. "The dining room is downstairs, Victor." "I moved it," he whispered, leaning in to kiss her forehead. His skin felt cold. "I realize the nursery is the heart of this home. It's where our future begins. I wanted our anniversary dinner to be where our daughter will sleep." He opened the nursery door. The room was transformed. Dozens of tall, thick pillar candles were placed around the perimeter of the room. Some were on the wooden dresser, others on the plush rug, and one large candelabra sat precariously on the edge of the wooden crib. The flickering orange light cast long, dancing shadows against the sage walls. "Victor, it's a bit much, isn't it? All these candles near the curtains." Elara felt a sudden prickle of sweat on her neck. The room was already stiflingly hot. "It's perfect," Victor insisted, guiding her to the armchair in the corner. "I used a special scent. Can you smell it? It's an oil I found. It's supposed to help with labor preparation." Elara sat, her heart beginning to thud against her ribs. The smell wasn't lavender. It was heavy, cloying, and volatile. It smelled like a mechanic shop. It smelled like the red canisters Victor kept in the garage for the lawnmower. "I forgot the wine," Victor said suddenly, his hand on the doorknob. "Non-alcoholic for you, of course. Stay right there. Don't move. I want to capture this moment when I come back in." "Victor, wait." He stepped out, his face illuminated by the candlelight. For a split second, the mask slipped. The warmth vanished, replaced by a clinical, detached coldness. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a man finishing a chore. The door didn't just close. It slammed. Elara gasped, struggling to rise from the deep chair. "Victor? That was loud, honey. You'll wake the neighbors." She reached the door and turned the handle. It didn't move. She frowned, twisting harder. The heavy oak door remained seated firmly in its frame. "Victor? The door is stuck." "Victor?" Through the wood, she heard the distinct, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the heavy deadbolt being engaged. Then the sound of a second lock, one she didn't even know had been installed, sliding into place. "Victor, this isn't funny. Open the door." Silence followed, a thick, suffocating silence. Then a faint sound drifted through the crack at the bottom of the door. Fwumph! It was the sound of a heavy breath being taken by a beast. Elara looked down. A line of orange light appeared under the door. It wasn't the soft glow of a candle. It was a jagged, hungry flicker. A thin trail of liquid was seeping into the room from the hallway, and as it touched the base of the candles Victor had placed on the floor, The liquid turned into a wall of blue and yellow flame. The special oil wasn't for labor. The damp rugs weren't from a burst pipe. "Victor!" she screamed, lunging for the window. She looked out through the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Below, in the driveway, she saw the silhouette of their SUV. The headlights flickered on. Victor was standing by the driver's side door, looking up at the nursery window. He wasn't reaching for his phone to call 911. He was checking his watch. He climbed into the car, reversed out of the driveway without a second glance, and vanished into the night. Inside the nursery, the heat was rising at a terrifying speed. The curtains caught first, turning into twin pillars of fire that licked the ceiling. The sage green paint began to blister and peel like burnt skin. Elara fell to her knees, clutching her stomach as a massive, crushing wave of pain rippled through her. It wasn't just fear. The baby, sensing the sudden spike in adrenaline and the drop in oxygen, was kicking with a frantic, desperate energy. "No," Elara sobbed, the smoke beginning to coil around the ceiling like a black snake. "No, no, no." She looked at the candles Victor had so carefully placed. They weren't there for romance. They were fuses. He had turned their daughter's sanctuary into a high-speed incinerator. He hadn't just left her to die. He had choreographed it. The temperature in the room climbed to a blistering 90 degrees, then 100. The air was becoming a thick, gray soup of ash and poison. Elara crawled toward the crib, trying to find a spot where the smoke hadn't settled yet. Her pale yellow dress was already stained with soot, the hem singed by a stray spark. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice cracking as she pressed her forehead against the burning wood of the crib. "I've got you, little one. Mama's not going anywhere." But as the first support beam in the hallway groaned and collapsed, sending a shower of sparks against the nursery door, Elara realized the truth. The man she loved had calculated the value of her life, and he had decided that her ashes were worth more than her heartbeat. She was locked in. The house was screaming, and the only person who knew she was alive was currently driving away, waiting for the notification that his debt had been erased by fire. The metallic clack of the deadbolt was a small sound, but in the sudden, predatory silence of the hallway, it echoed like a gunshot. Elara stood frozen, her fingers still curled around the brass handle of the nursery door. She twisted it again, then again, her movements shifting from confused to frantic as the reality of the resistance met her palm. The door didn't just feel locked, it felt sealed, a heavy oak barrier between her and the man she had called home for 5 years. "Victor!" she called out, her voice pitching higher, cracking against the stillness. "Victor, the door is stuck. It won't open." She pressed her ear to the wood, straining to hear his footsteps, expecting to hear him curse the old hardware or laugh at a prank gone wrong. Instead, she heard the heavy, deliberate thud of his boots moving away from the door. He wasn't fumbling for a key. He was walking toward the stairs. Then came the second sound, a low, rhythmic hissing. It sounded like a snake coiled behind the baseboards, a liquid rushing through the vents. The air in the nursery, once sweet with the scent of lavender-infused candles, was suddenly pierced by the sharp, stinging odor of accelerant. It was the smell of a gas station, of a lawnmower, of a forest fire waiting for a spark. A split second later, the ceiling exploded in sound. The smoke alarm began to scream, a high-pitched, piercing electronic shriek that tore through the room. It was a sound of absolute emergency, a warning that the air was no longer safe, but as Elara looked at the locked door, the alarm felt less like a warning and more like a funeral dirge. "Victor, open the door. Something's wrong," she screamed, hammering her fists against the wood. "The alarm is going off. Victor!" Downstairs, the front door opened and shut with a definitive, heavy thud. Elara scrambled to the small nursery window, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs it felt like it might burst before the fire even reached her. Below in the driveway, she saw the silhouette of their SUV. The brake lights glowed a visceral, bloody red in the twilight. Victor stood by the driver's side door, his posture calm, almost relaxed. He looked up at the window, his face illuminated by the rising orange glow reflecting off the neighbor's siding. He didn't look afraid. He looked satisfied. He climbed into the car, and as the engine roared to life, a thin line of black smoke began to curl up from the floorboards at Elara's feet. He had timed it perfectly. The candles he had lit for their anniversary weren't decorations. They were the ignition. The rugs he had cleaned were soaked in fuel. "No," she gasped, her hands flying to her stomach. "No, no, please, not the baby." The heat hit her then, a physical blow that made her stagger back from the door. It wasn't a gradual warming. It was an aggressive, predatory rise in temperature. The air near the ceiling was already turning into a thick, gray soup of soot and ash. The smoke alarm continued its relentless, piercing scream, but it was being drowned out by a new sound, the hungry, rhythmic roar of the fire as it consumed the hallway carpet and began to lick at the underside of the nursery door. The wood of the door began to groan. Tiny plumes of white smoke started to jet through the keyhole and the gaps in the frame, pressurized by the heat in the hallway. Elara realized with a sickening jolt of terror that the hallway was already a chimney. If she opened that door now, the backdraft would incinerate her instantly. But if she stayed, she was in an oven. She lunged for the rocking chair, grabbing a hand-knitted baby blanket, a gift from her mother, and doused it in the half-full gallon of water she kept by her bed for nighttime thirst. She pressed the wet fabric over her nose and mouth, her eyes stinging as the first layer of black soot settled on her pale yellow dress. A sharp, searing contraction ripped through her midsection, forcing her to her knees. She groaned into the wet wool, her body buckling under the dual weight of labor and terror. The baby was kicking frantically, a wild, rhythmic thumping against her spine that mirrored her own panicked heartbeat. "I've got you," she whispered into the blanket, her voice a ragged sob. "I've got you." The heat in the room climbed to a blistering point. The sage-colored paint on the walls began to bubble and peel, curling back like burnt skin to reveal the dry wood beneath. The glass of the nursery window began to vibrate, humming with the intensity of the inferno outside the door. Elara looked back at the deadbolt. It was glowing. The metal had absorbed so much heat from the hallway fire that it was turning a dull, angry red. The wood around it began to char, blackening in a slow, circular crawl. She was trapped in a masterpiece of malice. Victor hadn't just left her. He had built a cage of fire and locked it with a key he had taken with him. As the smoke thickened, turning the room into a dark, suffocating tomb, the high-pitched scream of the alarm began to fail, its plastic casing melting, the sound warbling into a distorted, dying moan. The floor beneath her felt hot. The gasoline-soaked joists were beginning to give way. Elara crawled toward the corner furthest from the door, clutching her belly, her breath coming in shallow, desperate hitches. Every gasp felt like swallowing a handful of needles. She was 9 months pregnant, exhausted and abandoned. The man who had promised to protect her until his last breath had decided that her last breath should be taken in the dark, surrounded by the ashes of their unborn child's future. As the first flame finally licked through the bottom of the door, a jagged tongue of orange light that reflected in her wide, tear-filled eyes, Elara realized that the husband she knew was gone. In his place was a monster who had left her to burn for the price of a life insurance policy. She closed her eyes, the wet blanket her only shield against the 800-degree monster. "Please," she whispered to the rising roar. "Someone, please. The heat was no longer a sensation. It was a physical weight, a crushing hand pressing down on Elara's chest. The nursery, once a sanctuary of soft sage and dreams of lullabies, had become a pressurized chamber of toxic gray silk. Smoke coiled across the ceiling like a living thing, descending in thick, suffocating layers that forced Elara lower and lower until her belly was pressed against the searing floorboards. Every breath was a calculation. She knew the science of survival from a dozen late-night pregnancy forums she'd browsed. Smoke rises, oxygen lingers at the floor, but the theory was a cruel joke when the floor itself was beginning to vibrate with the roar of the inferno beneath it. She could hear the house screaming, the timber joists groaning as they warped under the skeletal fingers of the fire. Her eyes drifted to the mahogany chest in the corner, a hand-carved heirloom passed down through 4 generations of women. Inside were the only pieces of her history she had left: her mother's wedding veil, the yellowed letters from a father she barely remembered, and the heavy gold locket that was supposed to be her daughter's first inheritance. For a fleeting, desperate second, the instinct to protect her past flared up. She reached out a hand, soot-stained and trembling, toward the chest. Those items were the anchors of her identity. If they burned, she was a woman with no history. But then, a violent, jagged kick landed against her ribs. It wasn't the soft flutter of a dream. It was a frantic, rhythmic thumping. Her baby was struggling. The carbon monoxide was leaching into Elara's bloodstream, and through the umbilical cord, her daughter was tasting the smoke. The choice vanished. The past was dead. Only the future mattered. Elara turned away from the heirloom chest, her lungs burning as if she had swallowed a handful of needles. She needed oxygen, and she needed it now. She looked at the nursery window, but the glass was already spider-webbing from the heat, and the air outside was thick with the updraft of the burning siding. She needed a filter. She dragged herself toward the changing table, her movements slow and heavy. Every inch of progress felt like dragging her body through molten lead. She reached up, her fingers catching the edge of the diaper pail and the stack of thick, organic cotton cloths she had folded so carefully just 2 days ago. She pulled them down, a dozen white squares raining over her soot-covered dress. She fumbled for the glass of water on the nightstand, her hand shaking so violently that she nearly knocked it over. It was lukewarm, tasting of ash, but she poured it over the stack of cloths until they were heavy and dripping. She pressed 3 layers against her face, tying them behind her head with a strip of fabric torn from her hem. The relief was marginal, but it was enough. The wet cotton acted as a primitive sieve, catching the heavy particulates before they could sear her throat. "I've got you," she wheezed into the damp fabric, her voice sounding like a ghost's rattle. "Breathe, little one. Just breathe." She crawled toward the vent in the floor, hoping for a draft of fresh air from the crawl space, but as she reached it, a jet of blue flame shot through the grate. Victor hadn't just set the hallway on fire. He had poured the accelerant directly into the HVAC system. The house wasn't just burning, it was being purged from the inside out. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to take hold, but Elara forced it back. She looked around the darkening room, her vision beginning to tunnel. The smoke was so thick now that the flickering orange light of the hallway was the only thing giving the room shape. She saw the heirloom chest again. The wood was beginning to char, the antique finish bubbling away. Her history was melting, turning into fuel for the beast Victor had unleashed. She didn't look back again. She found the furthest corner of the room, the one spot where the exterior walls met and the structural integrity felt most solid. She curled into a ball, her back to the rising heat, creating a small, sheltered pocket of space with her own body. She used her arms to shield her belly, tucking her chin into her chest. The heat in the room climbed to a blistering point where the very air seemed to shimmer. Elara could feel the hair on her arms singeing, the scent of burning protein mixing with the chemical stench of the gasoline. The wet cloths over her mouth were already beginning to dry out, turning from a shield into a shroud. She had chosen. She had left her mother's veil to the flames. She had let her father's letters turn to ash. She had abandoned every physical piece of her life to ensure that the tiny, frantic heartbeat inside her had one more minute of oxygen. As the first support beam in the ceiling cracked with the sound of a falling tree, sending a shower of sparks and plaster onto her shoulders, Elara closed her eyes. She didn't pray for herself. She prayed for a miracle that could breathe through stone and fire. She prayed for the one thing her husband hadn't accounted for, a reason to keep fighting when the world was literally turning to smoke. The floorboards beneath Elara were no longer just warm. They were pulsing with a rhythmic, subterranean roar, a heartbeat of fire that mocked her own. She was curled into the tightest ball her body would allow, a human shield of soot-streaked skin and damp cotton. Above her, the air was a swirling vortex of black ash, a toxic ceiling that seemed to be descending with every ragged breath she drew. The smoke was so thick now that the nursery she had decorated with such hope was gone, replaced by a flickering, orange-tinted tomb. Then, the world inside her fractured. It wasn't a contraction like the ones before. Those had been warning shots, rhythmic and manageable. This was a tidal wave, a primal, bone-deep shifting that made her vision white out even in the darkness. Her body was no longer her own. It was a vessel being hollowed out by a force more powerful than the fire. She let out a muffled scream into the drying cotton cloths tied around her face, her fingers digging into the charred carpet until her nails bled. The timing was a cruel irony of biology. The extreme stress, the surge of adrenaline, and the plummeting oxygen levels had signaled to her body that the environment was no longer viable. Her daughter was trying to escape one death only to enter another. "Not yet!" Elara gasped, the words catching in a throat that felt as though it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. "Please, baby, not yet." But the fire didn't care about her pleas. A support beam directly above the crib gave way with a sound like a cracking whip, sending a spray of glowing embers across the room. One landed on the shoulder of her yellow dress, the fabric smoldering instantly. She didn't have the strength to swat it away. She could only roll her shoulder against the wall, the heat of the plaster searing her skin. Another wave of pressure hit her, lower and more insistent. The final push wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability. She was 9 months pregnant, trapped in a room reaching 800 degrees, and she was going into the final stage of labor. She dragged herself a few inches further into the corner, seeking the absolute furthest point from the burning door. The oxygen was almost gone. She could feel her brain slowing down, the edges of her consciousness fraying into a gray mist. She knew the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, the lethargy, the strange, detached calm. If she fell asleep now, neither of them would ever wake up. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, the sharp pain forcing her back into the present. She reached down, her hands shaking as she felt the shift in her body. The heat was intensifying, the air shimmering with a distorted, ethereal beauty that signaled the room was seconds away from flashover. "I've got you," she whispered, a mantra that was more a prayer than a statement. She used the last of the water in her glass to re-wet the cloths over her nose, then used her own body to create a small, tent-like canopy over her lap. If the baby came now, she had to ensure the infant's first breath wasn't a lungful of liquid fire. She braced her feet against the baseboard, her back against the corner where the two external walls met. She felt the house tilt slightly. The structural integrity was failing. Below her, the gasoline-soaked joists were turning to charcoal. With a guttural, primal sound that was drowned out by the roar of the flames, Elara surrendered to the final push. The pain was an inferno of its own, a white-hot spear that made the burning room feel cold by comparison. She was pushing against the weight of the house, against the weight of Victor's betrayal, against the very concept of death itself. She could feel the heat singing her hair, the smell of it acrid and terrifying. The nursery door was now a solid sheet of fire, the wood consumed, leaving only a rectangular mauve-orange light. The ceiling was beginning to sag in the center, a heavy belly of plaster and laugh that threatened to bury her. "One more," she hissed through gritted teeth, her eyes fixed on the flickering shadows. In that moment, Elara Hallbrook was no longer a victim. She was a force of nature, a mother standing at the gates of hell and refusing to let them close. She didn't have a doctor, she didn't have a husband, and she didn't have a plan. She only had the raw, unadulterated will to see her child's face. As the pressure reached its absolute zenith, a strange silence seemed to fall over her, a vacuum of sound in the middle of the chaos. She felt the release, the sudden, staggering lightness as the miracle occurred in the dirt and the dark. But as she reached down to pull her child into the small, protected pocket of air near her chest, the nursery window finally shattered. The glass didn't just break, it exploded inward as the heat differential became too great. A fresh rush of oxygen surged into the room, and for a heartbeat, it felt like a blessing. Then the backdraft hit. The influx of oxygen ignited the unburned gases in the room, creating a fireball that rolled across the ceiling. Elara shielded the tiny, what life in her arms with her entire upper body, her back taking the brunt of the heat. She was a human shield, a bridge between the fire and the future. She looked down at the small, dark head of her daughter, who had yet to make a sound. The baby's eyes were closed, her skin covered in the same soot that coated Elara. "Breathe," Elara whispered, her voice a dying ember. "Please, just one breath." The room was turning into a furnace. The floor was groaning, and as Elara's eyes began to close, the shadow of a man appeared through the broken window, framed by the skeletal remains of the nursery wall. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like an angel draped in heavy, soot-stained armor. The sound of the nursery window shattering was a high-pitched scream that cut through the low-frequency roar of the inferno. Shards of glass didn't just fall, they exploded into the room, propelled by the sudden, violent rush of fresh air that fed the hunger of the flames. For Elara, the sound was the final bell. She lay slumped in the corner, her back a scorched shield, her arms trembling as they cradled the small, silent bundle of her newborn daughter. The world was fading into a hazy, orange-tinted gray, her consciousness slipping away like water through cupped hands. Then a heavy, gloved hand gripped the jagged frame of the window. A figure vaulted into the room, a silhouette of black Kevlar and reflective yellow stripes framed by the hellscape outside. Elias Rowan didn't see a woman at first. He saw a wall of smoke and a floor that was beginning to liquefy. His oxygen mask hissed, a rhythmic, mechanical breathing that sounded like a heartbeat in a graveyard. He moved with a practiced, aggressive urgency, his heavy boots crushing charred picture books and melted plastic toys. He swung his thermal imager across the room, the screen flashing a blinding white where the fire was hottest, until it settled on a small, heat-radiating shape in the far corner. He lunged forward, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight as he dropped to his knees beside the collapsed woman in the singed yellow dress. "I've got you!" His voice came through the comms mic, muffled but resonant. "Stay with me. I've got you." He reached out to pull her toward the window, his hand catching her shoulder, but as Elara's head lolled back against the scorched plaster, the movement forced her to look up. In that moment, the roar of the fire seemed to vanish. The ticking clock of the collapsing roof went silent. Elias reached up with one gloved hand and pushed his face shield back, desperate to get a clear look at the victim's vitals. As he leaned into the small pocket of relatively clear air near the floor, their eyes locked. Time didn't just slow down, it ceased to exist. Elias froze. His breath hitched in his throat, a sharp gasp that had nothing to do with the smoke. He was looking at a face he saw every morning in the mirror, the same high cheekbones, the same slight arch in the left brow, the same deep, amber-flecked eyes that looked back at him from his own reflection. But it was more than just a resemblance. It was a visceral, biological pull, a tether that had been severed 2 decades ago suddenly snapping back into place with the force of a lightning strike. He looked down at her shoulder, where the thin fabric of her dress had been burned away. There, etched into the dark skin of her collarbone, was a small, crescent-shaped birthmark. It was a mirror image of the one hidden beneath his own heavy turnout gear. Elara! The name tumbled out of him, a ghost of a memory he hadn't known he carried. Elara's wide, soot-stained eyes searched his. Through the haze of pain and the fog of near death, a spark of recognition flickered. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he had come from. But as she looked at the man kneeling in the fire to save her, the primal terror in her chest was replaced by a staggering, impossible sense of safety. She wasn't being saved by a stranger. She was being found. "You!" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. The moment was shattered by the ceiling above them. A massive support beam, eaten through by the gasoline-soaked flames, snapped with a sound like a thunderclap. A shower of sparks and heavy plaster rained down, hitting Elias's back. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to feel it. He simply leaned further over her, his broad shoulders creating a secondary roof of safety, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm Elias," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion that defied the professional coldness of his training. "I'm your brother, and I am not letting you go. Not again." The weight of the words seemed to give Elara a final, desperate surge of strength. She shifted the tiny, soot-covered infant in her arms, lifting her toward him. It was an act of ultimate trust, a mother handing her miracle to the only person in the world who shared her blood. Elias took the baby, his massive, gloved hands moving with a delicacy that was almost holy. He tucked the infant into the reinforced chest pocket of his jacket, securing her against his own heart. Then he looped his arm under Elara's knees and around her waist, hoisting her from the burning floor in one fluid, powerful motion. The nursery door finally gave way, a wall of flame rolling into the room like a wave. Elias didn't look back. He turned toward the shattered window, toward the ladder and the night air and the life that was waiting for them outside the inferno. He had entered the house to do his job. He was leaving it with the piece of his soul that had been missing for 25 years. As he stepped onto the ledge, cradling his sister and her child against the backdrop of the burning sky, the fire behind them was nothing compared to the heat of the recognition that had just changed their lives forever. The husband had tried to turn her into ash. He hadn't realized he was just clearing the way for her bloodline to find her. Elias tightened his grip, his eyes hard and focused as he began the descent. The rescue was over, the reckoning was about to begin. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the intensive care unit was a jarring contrast to the roar of the inferno that still echoed in Elara's mind. She lay beneath layers of heated blankets, her skin a map of minor burns and deep, ingrained soot that the nurses had spent hours gently scrubbing away. Her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass, each breath a rattling struggle against the smoke inhalation that had nearly claimed her. But in the plastic bassinet beside her bed, the steady, rhythmic pulse of a heart monitor provided the only music she cared to hear. Her daughter was alive, a tiny miracle sleeping soundly under the watch of the hospital staff. The door to the private room swung open, and Elias stepped in. He was no longer the soot-stained titan in heavy gear. He was a man in a simple navy sweatshirt, his eyes bloodshot and weary. He carried a thin manila folder, his grip on it so tight the cardboard was beginning to buckle. He pulled a chair close to the bed, the heavy silence between them vibrating with the weight of the night's events. "The doctors say your iron levels are plummeting," Elias said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "The stress of the labor and the blood loss, you're entering stage 2 shock. They need to do a transfusion immediately, but your blood type is rare. Extremely rare." Elara tried to speak, but her throat was too raw. She simply looked at him, her gaze drifting to the matching curve of his brow. "O negative with the Cal null phenotype," Elias continued, a faint, bittersweet smile touching his lips. "Less than 0.01% of the population. The hospital doesn't have a match on hand." They were panicking, Elara. They were calling regional centers, looking for a donor while you were fading out. He reached out, covering her hand with his. His skin was warm, a steadying anchor in her sea of pain. "I told them to stop looking. I told them to take mine." Elara's eyes widened, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Rare blood types were supposed to be familial, but she had grown up believing she was an only child, the product of a broken foster system that had lost her records decades ago. Elias opened the manila folder and pulled out 2 sets of documents. One was a weathered, yellowing birth certificate from 25 years ago. The other was a fresh laboratory report from the hospital's pathology wing. "I grew up in the same system you did, Elara, but I was moved 3 times before I was 5. They told me my sister had been adopted by a family out of state. I spent 10 years looking for a girl named Rowan. I didn't know you'd been given the name Holbrook. I didn't know I was looking for someone living 3 miles from my fire station." He laid the lab report on her blanket. The DNA markers were a near-perfect match. Siblings. Twins. "They just finished the cross-match," Elias whispered, his voice trembling with a decade's worth of suppressed grief and sudden, overwhelming hope. "It's not just a match, Elara. It's an identical serological profile. My blood is the only thing in the city that can save you right now. It's like we were made to protect each other." Elara felt a tear track through the lingering ash at her temple. The betrayal of her husband had left her feeling like a hollowed-out shell, a woman with no foundation and no future. But here, in the cold light of the ICU, the universe was handing back the piece of her soul that had been stolen before she could even walk. The man who had walked through fire to find her wasn't just a hero, he was her mirror. "Why?" she croaked, the word a painful rasp. "A corrupt social worker," Elias said, his jaw tightening. "They split us up to make the placements easier. They erased the twin status from the files to hide the paperwork trail. I've spent my life running into burning buildings, maybe hoping that one day I'd find someone worth staying for. I just didn't think I'd find you." A nurse entered the room, trailing in 4 pole and a bag of dark crimson life. She nodded respectfully toward Elias, who stood and rolled up his sleeve, revealing the small, crescent-shaped birthmark on his arm, the twin to the one Elara carried. As the needle found her vein, and the warmth of Elias's blood began to flow into her system, Elara felt a strange, surging strength. It was more than medical science, it was a reclamation. Victor had tried to leave her with nothing, to turn her and her child into a nameless tragedy for a payout. He had tried to strip her of her life, but he had accidentally triggered a reunion that would be his undoing. Elias leaned down, his forehead resting against hers as the transfusion continued. The connection was physical now. His heart was literally pumping life back into her limbs. "Sleep now," he whispered. "I'm not leaving this door. And when you wake up, we're going to talk about Victor. He thinks he burned down your life, Elara. He doesn't realize He just lit the signal fire that brought me home." Elara closed her eyes, the steady hum of the hospital fading. For the first time in 5 years, the fear was gone. She wasn't an orphan anymore. She wasn't a victim. She was part of a bloodline that had survived the impossible, and as her brother's blood surged through her heart, she knew that the fire was only the beginning of Victor's nightmare. The reckoning was no longer a hope, it was a biological certainty. The air in the executive lobby of Sterling Assurance was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the quiet, clinical hum of high-stakes bureaucracy. Victor Holbrook sat on a velvet armchair, his posture a carefully curated masterpiece of grief. He wore a black suit that looked slightly rumpled, as if he hadn't slept in days, and he held a crumpled white handkerchief in his trembling hands. To any casual observer, he was a man hollowed out by tragedy, a grieving husband whose world had turned to ash in a single, horrific night. Inside, however, Victor's heart was racing with a cold, electric exhilaration. He had already checked his offshore account balances 3 times on the drive over. $3 million. It was more than enough to erase the gambling debts that had been suffocating him like a tightening noose. It was enough for a fresh start in a country where the name Holbrook meant nothing and the smell of gasoline was a distant memory. "Mr. Holbrook, the regional director will see you now," a receptionist whispered, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. Victor stood, letting out a long, shaky breath. He wiped at eyes that were dry but red-rimmed from the bourbon he'd used to irritate them before walking through the glass doors. "Thank you," he rasped. I want to get this over with. The house, the memories, it's all too much." He followed her into a spacious, wood-paneled boardroom. At the far end of the table sat Mr. Henderson, a man whose career was built on spotting the fine line between tragedy and fraud. Beside him was a stack of paperwork, the claim for the total loss of the Holbrook estate and the life insurance policy for one Elara Holbrook. "Please, sit, Victor," Henderson said, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "We've reviewed the preliminary fire marshal's report. It was a fast-moving blaze. A total loss. I can't imagine what you're going through." "It was the nursery," Victor sobbed into his handkerchief, the sound muffled and pathetic. "I told her we should move those candles. I told her they were dangerous. If only I hadn't gone out to get that anniversary wine. If only I'd been 10 minutes faster." "The candles," Henderson repeated, scribbling a note. "Yes, the report mentions multiple points of origin. High-intensity ignition. It's a miracle the structural remains were even cool enough to inspect by yesterday morning." Victor nodded frantically. "The fire department was so slow. By the time I got back, the whole second floor was a wall of flame. I tried to go in. I swear I did, but the heat was approximately 800 degrees at the point of impact." A new voice interrupted. The voice didn't come from Henderson. It came from the shadows of the back corner, where a heavy door led to a private observation room. The door swung open, and Elias Rowan stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing his Firefighter's turnout gear today. He was in a crisp, dark uniform, his brass captain's bars gleaming under the LED lights. His face was a stone mask, his eyes fixed on Victor with a predatory intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. Victor's sobs died in his throat. He squinted at Elias, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Who are you? This is a private meeting." "This is Elias Rowan," Henderson said, his tone shifting from sympathetic to razor-sharp. "He's a ranking fire captain who led the primary rescue at your residence. He's here to provide the final expert testimony required to close the claim." Victor felt a cold bead of sweat roll down his spine. Rescue? There was no rescue. The house was gone. The report said there were no survivors found in the initial sweep. The initial sweep happened while you were already halfway to a motel under a false name, Victor, Elias said, walking slowly toward the table. He didn't sit. He leaned over it, his shadow falling across the insurance documents like a shroud. I was the one who went through the nursery window. I was the one who found the locked deadbolt. It was an interesting choice, Victor, locking a pregnant woman inside a room filled with accelerant. Most people would call that murder. In my line of work, we call it a backdraft trap. Victor's face went pale, the artificial redness of his eyes now clashing with the sickly gray of his skin. I don't know what you're talking about. The lock must have warped in the heat. It's an old house. Steel doesn't warp into a locked position from the outside, Victor, Elias whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal, controlled rage. And gasoline doesn't pour itself into the HVAC vents. You have no proof, Victor hissed, his voice losing its grief-stricken tremor and sharpening into a cornered snarl. This is harassment. Henderson, are you going to let the civil servant threaten me? I want my payout. Now. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a scorched, blackened baby monitor, the same one Victor had used to broadcast his final, cruel goodbye to Elara. Modern monitors have a cloud-sync feature for baby's first sounds, Victor. Your wife was tech-savvy. She had the premium subscription. Everything you said to her, the insurance policy, the gambling debts, the mercy of her death, it didn't burn. It uploaded. Victor lunged for the bag, his chair clattering backward, but Elias caught his wrist in a grip that felt like a set of iron shackles. The strength in the firefighter's hand was absolute, the product of a decade of hauling lives out of the dark. You're not getting a cent, Victor, Elias said, his face inches from his brother-in-law's. And you're not leaving this building. You can't prove anything with a recording, Victor shouted, his composure finally shattering. She's dead. It's my word against a ghost. Elias let out a short, jagged laugh that sent a chill through the room. That's the thing about fires, Victor. Sometimes they don't finish what they started. Sometimes they just reveal what's been hidden for 25 years. Elias turned his head toward the back door. You can come in now. The door opened again. Victor's breath hitched, a strangled sound escaping his throat as he stumbled back against the mahogany wall. Elara walked in. She was pale, her arm in a sling and a bandage across her temple, but she was standing. She was holding a small, bundled blanket against her chest, the tiny, rhythmic movement of a sleeping infant visible in the crook of her arm. She didn't look like the broken, terrified woman Victor had left to melt in the nursery. She looked like a queen returning to claim a kingdom he had tried to burn. "Hello, Victor," Elara said, her voice clear and cold as ice. "I believe you were just telling Mr. Henderson how much you missed us." Victor collapsed into the chair, his mouth working but no sound coming out. The handkerchief he had used for his fake tears fell to the floor, landing in a pathetic, crumpled heap. He looked at Elara, then at Elias, the realization finally dawning on him. The firefighter wasn't just a witness. The faces were identical. The birthmarks. The eyes. He hadn't just failed to kill his wife. He had accidentally summoned her protector. "The police are in the lobby, Victor," Elias said, stepping back and crossing his arms. "They're not here for a claim. They're here for a confession." As the heavy doors of the boardroom opened to reveal the blue uniforms of the waiting officers, Elara didn't look away. She watched the man who had tried to erase her life be led away in steel cuffs, her brother's hand resting firmly on her shoulder. The fire was out, but the warmth of the bloodline Victor had tried to ignore was just beginning to burn. The Sterling Assurance lobby, which only moments ago had been a stage for Victor's hollow performance, now felt like the center of a collapsing star. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical click of Victor's own wedding ring tapping against the mahogany armrest as his hands began to shake. He stared at Elara, his eyes wide and bulging, tracking her as she moved across the polished marble. She didn't stumble. She didn't look like a victim. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who had walked through the mouth of hell and returned with the devil's secrets. Victor tried to stand, but his knees buckled, sending him sinking back into the velvet chair. "Elara!" he choked out, the name sounding like a mouthful of ash. I thought, the fire, the news said." "The news said what you wanted it to say, Victor," Elara interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a shard of ice. She stopped 3 feet from him, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminating the stark reality of his failure. With a slow, steady hand, Elara shifted the hospital gown beneath her light cardigan, pulling the fabric away from her shoulder and collarbone. The skin there was no longer smooth. It was a map of angry, red welts and blistering heat blooms, the permanent signature of the 800-degree monster he had unleashed. The scars were jagged and raw, a physical manifestation of the night the nursery turned into an oven. "Look at them, Victor," she whispered, her gaze unfaltering. "Look at the price of your fresh start. This is what $3 million looks like on human skin." Victor's gaze darted from the scars to the bundle in her arms. He looked as if he wanted to vomit. The cold, calculating man who had checked his watch while driving away from a burning house was gone, replaced by a coward facing the living evidence of his malice. Is it? He couldn't finish the sentence. Elara adjusted the blanket, revealing the sleeping face of the infant. The baby was peaceful, her chest rising and falling in a perfect, healthy rhythm that mocked the chaos Victor had created. "Her name is Maya," Elara said, her voice softening only for a second as she looked at her daughter. "She took her first breath in a room filled with gasoline and soot. She survived the darkness you built for her, and she will grow up knowing exactly what kind of man her father was." The lobby began to fill with the quiet, urgent footsteps of the police officers Elias had summoned, but Elara didn't move. She wanted Victor to see her. She wanted him to feel the weight of the bloodline he had tried to erase. Elias stepped up beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The visual parallel was devastating. The two of them, identical in their defiance, standing as a united front against the man who had underestimated the strength of their shared blood. "You told the insurance company it was an accident, Victor," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You told them the candles tipped over. But accidents don't lock deadbolts. And accidents don't result in a brother finding his long-lost sister in the middle of a 5-alarm fire." Victor looked up at Elias, the realization finally curdling in his gut. He hadn't just failed to kill a wife. He had accidentally declared war on a dynasty. You're her brother," he stammered, his mind grasping for a way to manipulate the situation. "Elara, honey, I was in debt. I was scared. They were going to kill me. I did it for us, so we could have a future." Elara leaned down, her face inches from his. The scent of the hospital, antiseptic and clean, clashed with the phantom smell of smoke that Victor would never be able to scrub from his memory. "You didn't do it for us, Victor. You did it for a payout. You traded your daughter's life for a clean ledger." She reached out, her fingers brushing the handkerchief Victor had used for his fake tears. She picked it up and dropped it into his lap as if it were a piece of trash. "Keep your tears. You're going to need them where you're going." As the officers moved in to hoist Victor from the chair, the ghost in the lobby didn't flinch. She stood tall, her back straight despite the pain of her healing burns. She watched as they turned him around, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking shut over his wrists, a sound that echoed the deadbolt he had turned on her just days before. Victor looked back one last time, his face a pathetic mask of pleading, but Elara had already turned away. She turned toward the light of the windows, toward her brother, and toward the daughter who would never know the fear of a locked door. "Let's go, Elias," she said softly. "The air is getting thin in here." She walked out of the Sterling Assurance building, leaving the ashes of her marriage on the marble floor. The sun was warm on her face, a gentle heat that didn't burn, and for the first time in her life, Elara Holbrook knew exactly who she was. She wasn't a victim of Victor's fire. She was the flame that had survived it. And as she stepped onto the sidewalk, flanked by the brother who had walked through hell to find her, she knew the real story was just beginning. The fire had taken her past, but it had given her a future that no amount of insurance money could ever buy. The courtroom was as cold and silent as the nursery had been on that final night, but this time the silence belonged to Elara. She sat in the front row, her hand clasped firmly in Elias's, watching as the legal machinery of the state ground Victor Holbrook into nothingness. The evidence was an avalanche she couldn't outrun. The digital footprint of his gambling debts, the scorched baby monitor's cloud-synced confession, and the expert testimony of a fire captain who happened to be the twin brother Victor never knew existed. Victor stood before the judge, a shadow of the arrogant man who had once adjusted his silk tie while watching a house burn. When the sentence was read, life without the possibility of parole for attempted first-degree murder and aggravated arson, he didn't shout. He simply collapsed, his face hitting the defense table with a hollow thud that signaled the absolute end of his era. Under the Scorched Earth legal strategy Elias had helped coordinate, every asset Victor had tried to protect was seized. His bank accounts were drained to pay for Elara's medical bills and the long-term care of the daughter he had tried to discard. He was led away in chains, stripped of his name, his fortune, and his freedom, destined to spend the rest of his life behind stone walls where the sun never reached. 6 months later, the air at the old Holbrook estate no longer smelled of gasoline and ash. It smelled of fresh cedar, rain-washed earth, and hope. Elara stood on the newly poured concrete of the front porch, Maya balanced on her hip. The house hadn't been rebuilt as a suburban mansion, it had been transformed. With the insurance payout Victor had tried to steal and the proceeds from his liquidated assets, Elara and Elias had created the Rowan Sanctuary. The blackened timber had been replaced with reinforced steel and glass, turning the site of a near tragedy into a high-security refuge for women and children escaping domestic peril. The nursery, where Elara had nearly died, was now a sun-drenched playroom with reinforced exits and a state-of-the-art emergency system that ensured no one would ever be locked in again. Elias walked up the steps, carrying a crate of supplies for the sanctuary's first residents. He stopped beside his sister, looking out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set in a soft, non-threatening orange. The resemblance between them was even more striking now that the soot was gone and the stress had been replaced by a shared purpose. They were no longer the separated twins of a corrupt foster system. They were the pillars of a new legacy. "It's ready," Elias said, his voice quiet but filled with a deep, resonant pride. "The first family arrives tomorrow. A mother and 2 sons. They're coming from 3 towns over." Elara nodded, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery lines of the burn scars on her shoulder, scars she no longer hid. They weren't marks of shame. They were her medals of honor. "Victor thought he was erasing a family when he lit that match," she whispered, looking down at Maya, who was reaching for Elias's silver captain's badge. "He didn't realize that some things are fireproof. Like blood," Elias added, reaching out to ruffle Maya's hair. The Rowan twins stood together as the lights of the sanctuary flickered on, one by one. The fire had intended to leave Elara with nothing, but in its wake it had revealed a brother, a calling, and a strength that could never be burned away. As the front gate clicked shut, a sound of safety, not a trap, Elara finally let out the breath she had been holding since that anniversary night. The ashes were gone. The reckoning was complete. And for the first time in 25 years, the Rowan family was finally, truly home. Thank you for watching Afro Soul Love Diaries. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell.